In this video, I'll explore the wound, the nature of the wound, the direction of healing, the direction of deterioration or disintegrating into a deeper state of violation, of pain. And in doing so, just bring some of the different dynamics into clearer focus. So the first thing to look at is the correlation between competency and pain. Now, it's purported that Einstein said that the single most important question is the universe a friendly place? And it is a very important question because if the universe is a friendly place, then it makes sense to reach out and relate to the 99.99% of the energy pattern of which we are a part, a very small part, of which we are a part, the energy ecology that we emerge out of. That is 99.99% bigger than ourselves. Because when the universe is perceived as an unfriendly place, our greatest fear is of the unknown, of the other, of change, which links to the unknown and the other, of chaos and being out of control. The law of mass dictates that whenever two energies collide, when a bowling ball and a pinball collide, the pinball goes flying in the collision and the bowling ball continues on its original trajectory. And if the part of the ecology that we do not identify with is vastly bigger than ourselves and thus out of our control and is hostile towards our sense of identity, then the appropriate strategy is to hide, to lie, to protect ourselves by not being where we pretend to be, by not being the people we pretend to be, to stay in very small portions of the energy field that we control, in the extreme fearing to leave our own houses, refusing to talk to strangers, because it's all out there. And the belief that it's unfriendly leads to a need to self-preserve by hiding and limiting and shielding. And it's ultimately a losing battle, meaning we are one of the smallest patterns of energy as individuals in the universe. And we are interdependent with the universe for oxygen, for laws of gravity, for laws of physics, for self-generating DNA, the entire ancestral history, for food, for water, for warmth. I mean, there's nothing of this energy form that came from us alone. It's all dependent on all of these external forces, which, if they are hostile towards us, creates a very schizophrenic relationship with these larger patterns. Now, one of the most fundamental drives in all healthy human beings who have not been cross-wired, for example, to correlate or conflate abuse with love and things like that. All healthy human beings desire innately to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. Now, what's the variable in how well we do as individuals, as families, as communities, and as cults or cultures? It's competency. We identify ourselves through habits. We recognize ourselves through habits of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. I'm referring to looking in the mirror and seeing this pattern of energy that looks familiar, looking back in the mirror and saying, oh, that's me. I've seen that pattern before. So we all hold an identity. In fact, a number of identities, different patterns for work, or this person or that person, when we're alone, when we're meditating, when we're in a good mood, a bad mood. We all hold a series of patterns known as our identity. And we recognize that identity, and others recognize our identity, because it's the same pattern as it was before. And our identity is a generative tool. It's reactive, meaning all of our identities have been formed ecologically in relationship with our environments. But they're also proactive in that our habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being has a tremendous influence on the lives that we live, the world we create, and by lesser extents, the worlds and realities that we touch of people around us. And our identity has an intelligence index. It has an indicator of how intelligent we are. When we are highly intelligent, we use very little energy, very little time, money, natural resources to generate high levels of sustainable well-being for ourselves, and then in ripples out to a larger and larger world, because as social, interconnected individuals, we are infected by the state of other human beings around us. This has been proven over decades as a proximity association. In the PBS series, This Emotional Life, the study was kind of outlined a little bit that if we want to be happy, if we want to be enthusiastic, if we want to be hopeful, if we want to be more generous, the best indicator of our success is the people in close proximity to us. And so, as part of creating sustainable well-being for ourselves, we have to influence higher levels of human states in those around us. Or statistically speaking, we fail. Meaning, if we just focus on the egoic, limited pattern of us and ignore the ecology that we are interconnected with, we will ultimately be influenced by our environment, and we will attune to it. The law of resonance shows that whenever two patterns of energy are in proximity, they will ultimately resonate with the same frequency. You can think of lovers' heartbeats ultimately pairing up, the child in the womb ultimately pairing up. families ultimately having a rhythm, whether that rhythm is a rhythm of torment, of shame, of suffering, or a rhythm of joy and encouragement. What we're in proximity with ultimately affects us more than willpower, which means that in many ways the uses of willpower are to influence our environment such that the environment is conducive to the state that we want to default to, because ultimately the environment has more influence on our chronic state, positive, negative, or mixed, than an effort of will. And this is borne out in studies. If you take 100 people and you give some of them small doses of arsenic, some of them negative suggestions, some of them rotten food and excruciating temperatures and low water and no vitamin C, and expose them to plague. And then you take 100 other people and you expose them to high levels of nutrition, creativity, positivity, adult love, and then just correlate, and you just take a random sample of people. And over time, the environment prevails. Now, fortunately, most environments are not that extreme, and so there is a place for human will and assertiveness to try and overcome and feel positive while you're dying of arsenic, and feel excited while you're being tormented by your fellow human beings, and all of this stuff. And there is a gap between stimulus and response, and yogis and mystics have expanded that gap to be able to have and maintain their state in the face of higher and higher hurdles of environmental influence. But there is some state of intensity, decapitation usually being among them, that is beyond the belief of human consciousness to transcend, though who's to say that a yogi being decapitated may not maintain their state in other dimensions. They're certainly not doing so here once they are beheaded. So this is a little bit of context for the equation between competency and pain. The innate human drive is such that we all look for sustainable higher yields of well-being in a context of a certain level of competency. Now, at a very low level of competency, we expend energy to make our own and other people's reality worse with so much ignorance that we don't realize we're doing it, which is, of course, a particularly difficult spiral to get out of, because if a low level of competency combined with a high level of ignorance results in us making things worse, A, B, having no idea that we're doing so, and C, that we don't know how we're doing it, even if we grasp vaguely that we have something to do with it, we don't know how. This is a very difficult thing to get out of, and you can go round and round in that loop endlessly until an opportunity, a state of grace, until that pain leads to enough awareness that we then start adjusting the patterns and becoming then more aware, and so getting out of it that way. But low levels of competence results in scarcity of needed resources. Now, every human being has the same needs of resources. We need the physical sustenance, etc., to survive. We can't survive in 200 degrees below zero without a jacket. We depend on temperature, we depend on food, we depend on water, we depend on oxygen, we depend on being able to reproduce, having shelter, having medical care. So we have the need to survive. And as soon as we've met that need, our next need is the need to have security in that survival. And as soon as we've met that need, we have the need to conceptualize ideals, values, and move towards them. Now, in our cult, we value being cool. And being cool is to create the appearance that we know everything, that we are unaffected emotionally by just about everything, that we're in control, and that we're associated with other cool things, that we're modern, hip, sexy, don't need anyone. That's part of being cool. And are doing whatever the trendy thing is. So, and doing it well. So being competent is also cool. And the reference to temperature, the reference to coolness in this case, refers to those parts of lacking emotional intensity. I'm cool, I'm calm, I'm collected, and I'm in control of what? My feelings. And my things, my objects, things work. And of course, everyone who isn't cool wants to have some of that control, to not have burst into tears when their parents die, but just make some witty comment or say something, that appears cool. It's a reference to being relatively sociopathic, because a sociopath is incredibly perceptive, witty, cool, in control of things. You can't throw a sociopath off by upsetting their feelings because they're dissociated from their feelings. And so in many ways, the reptilian brain is idolized because an empathic brain with low levels of competency is a very painful experience. And when you cannot master creating a sustainably high state, it's incredibly painful to be very open to your feelings, because your incompetency is reflected in scarcity. The scarcity to meet your human needs. I'm barely surviving. I'm completely insecure about my ability to survive. My love and belonging, the next need, is weak. I don't know how. I don't know what love is. I don't know how to love myself. I certainly don't know how to love the wounded, helpless parts within. I don't have clear values and paths to realize those. I have not developed my specific talents. I don't know what they are. I know what the world likes and will pay me a lot of money for, but I don't know what my particular gifts are. I can't bring me abundantly into the world because I'm not really in touch with myself. I suppressed all of those things to cope and survive. And the idea of moving from my dissociated, traumatized state into a sense of transcendence is, beyond conception. I mean, the last thing I want to do is lose control. I'm in a reptilian state. And the reptilian brain, which is dissociated from all feelings other than fear and pain, is a it's somewhat desired in its numbness, in its coolness, when there's scarcity, when there's a lot of pain due to incompetence. Because the drive is there, but we're using cult defaults, we're using cult norms to create and meet our human needs. Our parents say that this is the way to do it. The cult is modeling, do it like this, learn these things, learn algebra, and you'll get a job and have a happy life. Well, if you learn algebra and it's not relevant in your job, and you still haven't learned, how to have an effective, loving relationship with yourself or other people, what do you do when you've done the cult protocol, but you're not any closer to well-being? You're in scarcity around self-love and love of others, or around self-esteem, etc. And so you've got a correlation between one's competency, one's ability to consciously create a high state through meeting one's own human needs and then supporting others to do the same, and how much scarcity there is around you and others. And the more scarce your needs are, because these are needs, Abraham Maslow in his work on human needs, these are not preferences. You don't get to prefer to breathe air. These are needs. And you don't get to prefer not to love yourself. I don't care about that. You're still going to wither psychologically without that need, just like your body will wither physically if you decide you don't care about water and food and things of that nature. These are needs. But it takes skill. It takes competency. And the reptilian brain can guide us towards survival with fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, or ass licking. But it can't guide us towards love and belonging, because a reptile is incapable of loving. It's capable of keeping us alive in a reptilian environment, which is reflected or grasped by the ego when there is repeated trauma in childhood that is not repaired. Because a child accurately assumes that if this was a healthy environment, I would not be repeatedly traumatized and then abandoned in a traumatized state with no path to repair, with no path to restore my humanity by reconnecting to my empathic brain. And there is a cycle of belief, just like there's a cycle of identity. Beliefs are part of the pattern of thinking. And when we believe that the universe is out to get us, we will tend to isolate and hide, etc. In a state of isolation and hiding, we are statistically more likely to be malnourished in socially, financially, etc. And so this elevates the pain and can be used then to confirm the belief. And so there's a chicken and egg dynamic with beliefs, where we tend to believe the things that we've experienced the most, and the things that we believe often lead us to behave in ways that lead to the re-experience of things that we've experienced the most. And in this way, beliefs are a little bit like small ropes on elephant legs. Because if, as a baby elephant weighing 300 or 400 pounds, a little rope is put around your leg, and every time you kick, your leg gets bloody and painful, and you can't break the rope. And so you develop a belief in the rope as a way to avoid pain. And so you believe after 100 or so kicks that the rope is unbreakable, that belief stops you from bloodying your leg for years. However, the belief that the rope is unbreakable leads the adult elephant that could break the rope to stay imprisoned for the rest of their lives. And so you see this dynamic where the belief was useful in minimizing pain for the baby elephant, but became more and more life-threatening if the elephant is enslaved in a lifestyle that guarantees torment and an early death. Then that belief that minimize the pain for one leg for the first year of life becomes the biggest threat to that elephant's well-being. And so there's this, this dynamic where belief sometimes correlates with reality and sometimes doesn't, but our behavior always correlates to our belief. If we believe clearly that our pain will go up if we step out of prison, we do not step out of prison. And that belief does not have to correlate with reality throughout time for it to define many parts of reality. Now, much of our reality as grown-ups, whether or not we have become adults, that's an important distinction, but as biological grown-ups, our body is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, much of our belief as grown-ups has an enormous influence on our behavior, if not, a direct control influence of our behavior. And a lot of our beliefs initially come from external sources. If we look at the maturation process of a human being, we go basically through childhood, adolescence, and into grown-uphood and possibly adulthood. And it's very common for people of our culture to not know if they are an adult because they don't feel any different. Their body is 10, 20, 30 years older than they were, but am I really an adult? What is an adult? And so it's very common to have grown children and adolescents in grown bodies. And that process is very important because a child is completely dependent on the outer environment and their parents or caregivers for all of their human needs. And as a result, the child begins with an unconditional yes. In the maturation process, there's a correlation between sympathy, antipathy, and synthesis. The child is in a place of yes, you want me to learn English and everyone's speaking English, I will learn English. You want me to learn Japanese and everyone's learning Japanese, I will learn Japanese. Mom frowns every time I get angry, I will suppress my anger. Dad says that those people are assholes, and sure, that's Dad knows better than I do. And so the child adopts and replicates the environmental pattern, psychologically, physiologically, culturally, etc. The child absorbs and internalizes the cult. Now, the next state in healthy development is antithesis, or adolescence. The healthy adolescent criticizes, rebels, rejects, questions, doubts, differentiates from everything unhealthy in the status quo. The child accepts everything The adolescent, often in reactivity, will reject everything, go into complete antithesis. But a healthy adolescent will definitely identify all of the flaws in the status quo and reject them. As the adolescent learns to think for themselves, they realize that no, being whipped does not hurt Dad as much as it hurts me. That's just some stupid thing he heard from his dad that he uses to make himself feel better. All you have to do is grab a whip and hit Dad and see if he screams louder than when he was hitting you. And suddenly you say, yeah, that's bullshit. And you say you're a Christian, but you're a complete selfish person who doesn't turn the other cheek. And my government says they're here for me, but they don't even respond to my emails. My teachers say that they're here to give me an education, but they can't answer why I'm learning calculus instead of how to drive, or why we're not talking about the fact that Dad's beating Mom up, and if I talk about it, I get humiliated. Why aren't I learning useful things that are relevant to the outer world? And so as the child moves into antithesis, into adolescence, their job is, of course, to differentiate themselves and become a new, distinct life form. That's the assignment that life gives every organism. The job of becoming unique. Because in the game of life, life always wins. And the way life wins is by iterating every card in the deck billions of times. Because if you have a billion decks arranged in a billion different ways, and you're in a given game where what you really need is a 6, you've got loads of them. You see, life is not invested in every single part of every card and every deck being used. It's invested in winning the game. And if there are continually more distinct and unique patterns of energy, there's always one of them, and perhaps many more, that will do the job, that will get the job done, that will survive, that will take life to the next iterative level of evolution. Nature doesn't need every species to win. Nature doesn't need every individual of every species to win. Nature just needs some parts of the vast experimentation of iterative, mutated energy patterns to be intelligent enough out of sheer luck or strategy and design to exist the next day, to take life forward. This is life's game. And to be a part of life's game, if you copy the old exactly and never rebel, never question, never doubt, never throw any of the stupidity of the status quo out, you have no value to life as an evolving species. In order to evolve, you absorb the pattern of energy that exists on the planet so far. That's sympathy in the child state. You must then analyze through pain. Every system has flaws. So if you're paying attention, you will experience those flaws in the system as pain in your body, in your heart, in your mind. Those gauges will say, ding, 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 ding. There's something fucked up here. It doesn't feel good when Mom hits me for not doing what I say I will do, and then sends me to my room when I point out that she didn't do what she said she would do. In other words, I don't get to make mistakes. Someone with much more experience and much more power gets to make mistakes, not me. and I feel small and valueless, etc. There's something wrong with that system. And the heart, the mind, the body will register that flaw in the system. It's not a very efficient system. It's a system that drives you crazy. It's schizophrenic. It's just not very well designed. And the adolescent's job is to bring those to full attention before becoming a self-generative and replicating the system. Its job is to become unique, to delete more of the flaws in the system, and through synthesis, the best of the old system and the best of rejecting the old system, and the best of the synergy between that. This is all that I don't like, this is all that I like, and here are some new things that I've never seen happen anywhere. Imagination is life's trump card in iteration. Because in the game of winning, if you have every card in the deck, if you have thousands of sixes of spades, of sixes of clubs, of 11 of, if you have thousands of each card in the deck, then whatever game you're playing, you've got a winning hand. And life is in the business of winning. It doesn't have to win all the time in all ways, but it continues. You watch the miracle over a 20 billion year winning streak. And life took something the size of less than a pea and created the entire multiverse, the entire universe within that multiverse, the entire galaxy, the entire solar system, billions of planets that one day, if they don't already, will have life. Life's in the game of winning. Whether we win or not, life can be assured over the next trillion years on many of those billion planets to grow and regrow and regrow and learn from mistakes and iterate and iterate and iterate until life realizes its potential, until life moves to a high state of intelligence, of consuming very little energy to create very high yields of sustainable well-being wherever life is found. Now, as the child moves from that sympathy and unconditional acceptance of parents, of culture, of government, etc., towards antipathy, children and other adolescents in grown bodies are threatened by being challenged. If you've gone from being an abused child to where now you're an abusive child in a grown body towards your child, there's a perception of climbing in rank. I was the victim, now I'm the abuser. I just internalized my abuser and did to my child, but now I'm on the top of that particular cycle of abuser and victim. I don't want to be dethroned and go back into being the victim, and so I'm threatened by any voice challenging my authority. In the most abusive environments, challenges to the status quo are met with swift and harsh torture, humiliation, ostracization, imprisonment, assignment to an insane asylum, execution, no one being willing to do business with you, everyone talking about you behind your back, various other abuses of power, murder, whatever it is, shouting, raging, abuse, violence. You're not allowed to go from the state of unconditional acceptance of the power structure towards antipathy, towards rebellion, towards pointing out all the flaws in the system. Because a very confident adult acknowledges as an innate truth. All systems are flawed, and it is the purpose of the adolescent to identify for the group, for the power structure, for the parents, everything that's wrong with the status quo, so that as they move forward and become the next part of the power structure, they do not copy and reiterate exactly what was done before at the same level of competency of the last generation. Otherwise, you're not seeing evolution, you're just seeing replication of an innately flawed, imperfect system, simply because the threat to the power structure is viewed as too great to the power structure, which means that the power structure is occupied by the child and or adolescent of grown-ups who have not reached adulthood. In this dynamic, the abuse levels, the pain that is dispersed and directed at a child as they begin to move towards adolescence in consciousness is so intense that they dissociate, that they regress, that they stay childlike and live in fear of the abusive children in grown bodies, of the cult of the government. They live in terror of their abuser, and they do not differentiate. They do not dare to question authority. In that state, they are beholden to the status quo, and life loses a generation. And so there can be shadow rebellion, resentment, passive aggressiveness, grunting, moaning, muttering, but there is no active honoring in the system of the adolescent, and their job to wholeheartedly rebel against everything that is always fucked up in every single system. Because as life gets better and things get less fucked up, there is less pain dispersed on the next generation. But as there is less pain dispersed on the next generation, their sensitivity to the remaining pain increases to a tolerable level. Meaning there is pain in any system, and we dull and numb out to a certain level of insensitivity that allows us to tolerate the prevailing environment. Just by, for example, if you raise a child on a construction site without ear protection, they will quickly go deaf to a point where the screech of a loud circular saw on wood is hearable, but they're deaf enough that it doesn't hurt their ears, because it hurt their ears too many times and they tuned out. They went deaf. And the same is true psychologically. If you humiliate someone 50,000 times with no awareness that you're doing it because you're in a psychologically illiterate cult, the person becomes relatively immune to that level of humiliation. They numb out to the point where they can operate in that level of hostility. But if the next generation is not humiliated at all, and then is humiliated once, 1/10 of the amount of the generation before, then that person will be bowled over by the cruelty of humiliating a child. It's like, what's up with that? And it'll be a traumatic event. Whereas for the person that went through 50,000 humiliations and survived it and numbed it out, they won't even notice that major event, because we sensitize, as a general rule, to tune out the status quo, whatever that is, good and bad, and then focus on the anomalies and making the situation a little better within that bandwidth. One variation or one kind of exception to that is nature and life produce, amongst a number of mammalian species, 10 to 20% of the population that's unusually sensitive. And so while 80, 90% of the population is often just fine and comfortable in the status quo, at least 10% of the population is unusually aware of the flaws in the system, of the lack of competency, and finds it unusually urgent to do something about, because they are biologically set to a higher point of sensitivity that requires more care to navigate through reality, and is innately more aware of what's good and what's flawed in the system. Now, the importance of whether or not someone gets locked into child or adolescent, because the adult is born in the facing of death. The adult must face their greatest fear, the fear of their own child and adolescent, of death, by confronting the source of life, the authority figure. And in doing so, liberate themselves to fully accept the sympathy of the child and the pain of the child in the wound, the rebellion of the adolescent and the important data that that brings to the next iterative cycle of life, and something more, the uniqueness of that adult. There is a death to the adaptive personality of the child, and there is a death to the complete reactivity that is bound to the status quo, because the adolescent cannot iterate. The adolescent can only say no to what is. It can say, I don't like that, and I don't like that, and I don't like that. But the adolescent cannot iterate and say, but I do really like this, and create something new to really imagine. If an adolescent age is doing that, a 15-year-old, they're touching into a part of their psyche that is the emerging adult. The adult is not age-bound. It cannot happen in a 3-year-old or something, but you can become much more adult at 15 than you are at 50 if you have not faced those fears, if your trauma at a young age has not captured you in a place where you cannot question the status quo. Now, the child and the adolescent are dependent on the external reality. And so they are dependent on the cult for external validation. Their parents, their teachers, their peers parents, TV. The child and adolescent cannot meet their human needs without the cooperation in a very active way by the cult. And so they are externally referenced. It's devastating and traumatic for an adolescent to be shunned, to be ostracized, to be kicked out of the house, that type of thing, because they cannot meet their own needs. They are dependent on an adult, and by definition, the child and the adolescent is not an adult. Now, this is why arresting a human being in childhood and adolescent trauma is such a big deal, because it means they will never be an adult in that arrested state, number one, which means they are completely dependent on external reference and validation, which means that their identity and their beliefs are formed by the predominant messages they have received in childhood and adolescence. And every belief has kind of a seesaw, a scale. The child internalizes everything is about them. That is the nature of the child's stage of development. If mom hits a child, it's not because mom is a bitch, it's because the child was unlovable. That's part of that yes state, that sympathy. Mom's perfect. Dad's perfect. The cult is perfect. The more the cult abuses a child, the more certain the child is that I am worthless, I am unlovable, I will never be loved, I'm fundamentally flawed, I have no value other than my usefulness as a kicking bag, and that's who I am. Now, at a certain point in taking on the shame and dysfunction of the cult, the pain of the child reaches a point that requires protection to endure. And the protective personas, the protective identities, are born and explore how they can numb and manage that level of pain. Now, some protectors dissociate from empathy because the empathic brain is the one capable of experiencing the true grief and sorrow of a grown human being abusing a child. And a child is not capable of processing that level of grief, that level of horror. And so there's a dissociation from the humanity within the child, from the empathic brain, and an association with the reptile, simply because in doing so, the protector has obscured a pain that the child cannot respond to and will not be able to respond to until they're an adult. But the catch-22 is, with massive amounts of unresolved trauma, the child is likely going to attach to an identity in an arrested, traumatized state that cannot grow up, because the attachment is to the abused identity that contains too much pain for a child to process. And that person is in an arrested state, bound in trauma, until an adult on the outside provides enough tenderness, enough healing, that that child can afford to come back into their empathic state, can find their humanity again, can validate their own feelings, and through the blessing of an elder, the blessing of an adult, can continue their development where it left off at 6 years old or 7 years old. And then once that safety reaches a certain point, they can become an adolescent and actively rebel and grasp the true cruelty of their childhood and the sources of that cruelty. And once that has been honored and the adolescent grasps, this is what I'm rejecting, this is what I like. Mom made great tacos. She was a horrible drunk. I'm going to make great tacos, and I'm not going to drink and abuse my kids. Now, the iterative process, if you go through a healthy adolescence, continues in evolution. In the child and adolescent state, though, there are messages in the environment. Some messages affirm my worthlessness. Mom didn't bother to look at my baseball game. I can't be that important. So-and-so, their mom watched their baseball game, but I'm not valuable enough to have a mother that watches my baseball game. Mom didn't remember this important promise. Mom didn't remember my birthday. Every one of these stacks up on the scale and says I'm worthless. And then there are things on the other side of the scale that, Mom did stick up for me this one time. And that goes on that side of the scale. I have some value. But the child and adolescent are externally referenced and will be eternally, meaning until the day they die, unless they become an adult. It is only the adult that is capable of referencing the self. And many human beings in a highly traumatized culture have never met themselves. In internal family systems therapy and protocol, there's a peeling of the onion process as one protector and coping strategy after another reveal themselves and reveal their role in keeping the body alive and pleasing the abusers and all of that. Then at the core, there's this luminous essential self that is eternal, that is always filled with blessing and love for all of the different roles, for the child, for the adolescent, but which is invisible until adulthood is achieved, which is why Robert Bly in his book, The Sibling Society, points out such a crisis in a culture that raises relatively few adults and many self-absorbed, traumatized children and adolescents in grown body, desperately competing child to abused child for scarce resources that a child and adolescent at a low level of emotional, relational, and psychological competency cannot provide. And so when you have scarcity, you have an either-or dynamic. There's only so much love. I'm able to be an adult one day a week from time to time. And then there's some love, and then it's gone again for a whole week or a whole month. And when love as a need for abused children in a highly abusive culture is so tenuous, can I sustain until the next little dose of love? Because the psyche in human beings are very much like a tomato plant. You can't tell a tomato plant, grow and be perfect and produce tomatoes, and then I'll give you a little water. No, you have to water and feed the tomato with air and sunlight and nutrients and water. And then it is the nature of a tomato to produce rich and healthy tomatoes when given a healthy environment. It is human nature to blossom and fulfill all their human needs and to become iterative contributing adults if they are given optimum growing conditions. And the catch-22, of course, is that when pain reaches a certain threshold, we dissociate from the pain because it's too debilitating. It's like a smoke alarm. If the smoke alarm coming from a fire, obviously, that's what sets the alarm off, but if it is so loud that you cannot think and you cannot put out the fire because you don't know what it is and you're too incompetent to figure out how to respond, you're going to put out the smoke detector because you're too dumb to put out the fire, but the smoke detector means you can't even get anything done while your house is burning down. And so you're going to try and put out the smoke detector. If you're too dumb in a psychologically illiterate cult to understand the messages of the body, the messages of feelings, why would you understand it in a cult that will design an education and work and retirement protocol without a single hour of formal emotional literacy? You've actually not only not learned anything scientific about your body and feelings, you've actually been taught dogma that shames and masks many of the body's messages and emotional states, such that you are alarmed by getting readings of your emotions in your bodies because they alarm your parents, who also did not know how to deal with their bodies and their emotions. So you become afraid of your daily readout of what's going on in your reality. Your feelings will tell you what's going on in your mind, in your body, in your world, in your anticipated future, in your past. Your mind will tell you what's going on in your feelings, what's going on in your outer world. Your body will tell you what's going on in your mind, your feelings, the outer world. You've got these beautiful thermometers that are constantly feeding you data of different dimensions and parts of reality. And rather than learn the art of reading that data and responding competently and thus producing abundance and thus reducing pain and increasing sustainable well-being, we are learned to fear the readout and not taught how to respond. And so we maintain a death spiral of incompetence, which leads to a cycle of scarcity, which leads to high levels of pain, which leads to high levels of dissociation from the empathic and transcendent brain and association with the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, reptilian brain, which leads to sociopathic behavior, which leads to more pain, which leads to other people dissociating from their humanity, their empathic and transcendent brain, and associating more with their fear-based reptilian brain. And it goes round and round, much like the cycle of belief, with little inroads being made by, the occasional teacher and transcendent individual. In order for a child and adolescent to make the bridge, in order for a child to move into adolescence, there must be a certain amount of tolerance or support. Because if the giants around that child are threatened by the movement into criticism and antipathy, they will effectively terrorize the child into staying regressed, directly or indirectly. Similarly, the adolescent must fully explore its antipathy to the mediocrity and problems in the status quo and be validated in a world that it depends on for validation before it can let go into the one that witnesses and accepts all the criticism and all the yes, and forms the synergy, the synthesis that emerges as the adult self. The nature of the wound is the transference of messages through behavior, through thought, through face, through tone. You are separate. You are worthless. You have no value. You are unlovable. You are disgrace. You are the source of all our problems. You're not wanted. You're not needed. Messages of dissociation and devaluation of the self correlate with behavior. You notice your parent enjoys your suffering. Would someone enjoy hurting a valuable person, a worthwhile person, someone they wanted to be close with? And so there is a transference of the message, the virus, the belief, I am worthless. And the protector personas that manage pain play a part in this viral nature. Because one group of protectors protects against certain levels of pain by dissociating with the inner victim and associating, identifying with the external abuser. When the pain gets too great for a 3-year-old being raped by an older brother or a father, when the pain gets too great, to be present in that identity of the wound, a protector of that small part comes in and transfers the consciousness of the victim, the identity of the victim, into the body of the abuser, and looks at the small one with the same hatred, with the same disgust, with the same unconsciousness as the abuser is looking at them. This is the transference of the virus. When the big one will not attune to the small one, when the therapist will not attune to the patient, when the government will not attune to the people, when the parent does not attune to the child, when the doctor does not attune to the patient, when the leader does not attune to the follower, the teacher to the student, when the masculine does not attune to the feminine, and the relationship of scale reaches a certain gap where it feels utterly hopeless, terrified, alone, and small, in opposition to an overwhelming pattern of energy that, when protested against, results in more violence and more pain. You see, insecure children and adolescents in grown-ups' bodies cannot tolerate the slightest criticism, even from a child. A 5-year-old protests being raped, and the insecure ego of the grown woman or man raping that child is so insecure, so outraged, that a 5-year-old would question them and their right to rape them, that they fly into a rage, that they beat the child, knock them unconscious, and then rape them, just to prove that there's some area of their life that they have some power, some control, some area where they're the big one. The child that learns that protesting the abuse leads to more abuse surrenders to the abuse and feels completely and utterly alone, because even they are attacking the warrior, the defender inside. Their fear that they'll be dead tells their own inner warrior to shut up. And the inner warrior cannot win against a giant and the internal self attacking it, and goes into despair. Despair kills very rapidly. Complete hopelessness and despair kills. You cannot sustain hopelessness, despair, loneliness, and self-hatred, which every child who has been repeatedly abused feels. They take the hatred of the parent for themselves and take it on as if I am hateful. The belief I am hateful then starts generating the kind of behavior that is consistent with what would a hateful person do. They wouldn't be successful. They wouldn't have lots of friends. A hateful person would hurt themselves, be hated, and do the things that would make other people hate them. So once that identity is locked in, now the identity becomes self-perpetuating. Once the child learns they cannot defend and protect themselves from the hate of their parent, they start behaving like that elephant that won't snap the cord. They will not behave beautifully and magnificently because they're tethered to the belief of their hatefulness. And they won't break it because last time they tried to break it, it nearly got them killed. And so it's a life-threatening crisis. It's a devastating state of events where the rational mind that may be in the present is insanely discordant with the memories and intense survival messages of a 2-year-old, of a 5-year-old, of a pre-verbal infant, desperately trying to figure out how they're going to weave through the probability field and make it into grown-uphood in a cult that's trying to kill them. In a cult where incompetency is so high that in this completely dependent state, they have to grasp that the people they're depending on are unreliable. They're so dumb they don't even grasp that they're dumb. It's a bit of research from David Dunning. So that's a crisis. Now, in order to survive that particular crisis, the protector says you're not the victim. You are the one with the power. You are the abuser. Imagine how enjoyable it is for your father to finally have something he can bully and win. He can't do it at work. He can't do it here. Women are rejecting him right and left because he has no emotional and psychological and relational literacy in a cult that denies these skills to him. But he can win with you. Imagine how great it feels to punch you out and know that you can never take revenge. Feel a little bit of power. That's hope. That you too can feel that. You just have to wait till you grow up. And you too can be a bully. Well, there's hope there. The hopelessness, the terror, the overwhelm, the dissociation subsides and is dissociated from. And what is identified with is exactly what dad's feeling, what mom's feeling, what the older brother, what the bully is feeling. And there's an aspiration because in the victim's eyes, the bully made it. The bully isn't being bullied anymore. The bully is now a bully. And so that's an identity that I can cling to, that can win. Well, once you've locked in the new identity, and we need an identity. So what happens is when you're traumatically dissociated from your original identity, the ego needs an identity. Now, if your original identity is in so much pain, so much shock, so much dissociation, so much helplessness and uncertainty, that it traumatizes you to be in that brain, you're going to grasp for a new identity. A new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And the easiest pattern to grasp to is the pattern of the perpetrator, of the survivor. Could be a direct perpetrator, it could just be a survivor. It could be like, that famous person, they're not dealing with this. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And the self grasps and attaches to a new identity. This can be conscious or unconscious. But once the perpetrator identity is attached to as the lifesaver to avoid the pain, once the protector dissociates you from the victim that you can't win to the perpetrator where you can, and provides a path to a future where you too can perpetrate and call it love or whatever it is, or say shut up and send people to their room. Once you've got that, now you've got a path towards replicating. You're now in a replicating path. You've identified with the parent, the teacher, the abuser, and you're going to unconsciously replicate them, because you can't consciously analyze that, because then you'd have to compare with the victim that has been it's exploded into too high a pain for you to go in there and cope, because you're not yet an adult. The adult can go into these explosive parts and love and care. That's the only one that can liquefy and restore healthy identity. But if your abuse is happening too early and you haven't met or discovered the adult, you cannot face that as a child, as an adolescent. You can simply internalize the abuser. In this way, it is a form of self-preservation and protection to abuse other people in the same way you were abused, so as to not feel or remember being abused when you were helpless. And so the way that works is, the psyche is circular in nature, and there's all kinds of associative trigger events. So you've buried and you've suppressed the victim, and you've overcompensated and kind of tried to become the opposite of that victim, and at times internalized the abuser, and you've got the abuser persona and various things. And then something comes up that reminds you, that takes you into the location in the body and the brain where that terror that you couldn't respond to, that was going to kill you, resides. And the alarm bells start going off. You're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die. Your conscious mind doesn't know why, because you've dissociated and forgotten what that felt like and forgotten what happened. But your body is saying, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And the protector that got you out of that fix says, don't worry. We're going to go and abuse someone right now in the exact way that this was abused. And just like pretending you were the one who was hurting you, this is going to strengthen the identity of the abuser, where you're the one on top with the power. And that will provide medicine for the helplessness, and it will distract you from that terror and overwhelm. When you're raping someone, it will give you protection. I'm not the rape victim. I'm the rapist. Because you cannot go into that domain where you are the rape victim as a regressed child or an adolescent, because you lack the competency to heal and love that wound. And if you identify with the helplessness, the terror, and the worthlessness that you felt at that time, and start adopting that identity, your survival is at an end, because this cult around you doesn't know how to help you in that state. This cult will not pull you out of the pit of that abuse. It will punish you for even bringing it up, because it's not willing to deal with the sociopathic cruelty and incompetence needed to bring its citizens cradle to grave without a single hour of science-based emotional literacy, of trauma literacy, of relational literacy. We learn all about how to abuse ourselves and others vicariously and through direct experience, but we do not learn how to heal that abuse. We learn to numb it and move on, which means it's still there, waiting for the spiral pattern of life to bring it up again. Are you ready to deal with me yet? And the child and adolescent, regressed in shame, trauma, guilt, ignorance, and terror of their own feelings, says, no, I'll do anything to avoid feeling that again. And the protector comes in and says, okay, you be a perpetrator, and that'll get you out of this vortex. You cannot feel that degree of helplessness while you are making someone else. You're transferring your state to them. Now they will deal with what you cannot deal with. And you don't have to. You've escaped again. The pattern of perpetration follows the pattern of being sucked into the vortex of helplessness, pain, and shame of the wound. And this is why the greatest perpetrators are always the greatest victims. Because if the pain is incredibly deep, if the pain is incredibly overwhelming, then the amount of perpetration you have to do to pull yourself out of that gravitational identity and into something else as a regressed, traumatized child and adolescent is you have to do something extreme. Now, sometimes this is where cutting comes in. If you cut yourself, or go drunk, or get drunk, or bang your head, or smash a car, you can also avoid that particular helplessness in that way. It's like, fine, I'll ruin a car happily rather than go into that horrible state and be left there helpless. I'll crash, I'll do whatever it takes, I will destroy. What I cannot do is be present and conscious as a regressed child and adolescent, re-entering the wound that everyone has hated, that I have learned to fear, and that no one will help me out of, because I'm surrounded by reptiles who are in the same trap to one degree or another in their own lives, and are coping with it by punishing anyone who reminds them and just moving on.